Welcome to the midweek message. We're taking a lesson from 1 John chapter 3, and we're reading verses 4 through 6, and I'm reading from the New Century Version of the Bible. 1 John 3 and verse 4. The person who sins breaks God's law. Yes, sin is living against God's law. You know that Christ came to take away sins and that there is no sin in Christ. So anyone who lives in Christ does not go on sinning. Anyone who goes on sinning has never really understood Christ and has never known him. And we're going to look at these verses individually. So 1 John chapter 3 and verse 4. The person who sins breaks God's law. Yes, sin is living against God's law. A couple of things from this verse. It defines sin. Sin is breaking the law of God. It's not breaking a rule. It's not committing a crime necessarily as defined by society. But when you break God's law, that is sin. And then it says something else about sin, giving a little bit of a different connotation when it says, yes, sin is living against God's law. There is a difference between committing a sin and living in sin. And we're going to look at that in the next couple of verses. Verse 5. You know that Christ came to take away sins and that there is no sin in Christ. Now, when a person sins or lives in sin, they are living against God's law and against the purpose for which Christ came. That was his reason. There is no sin in Christ. He's holy, and he came to take away our sins so that we could be like him. And verse 6. So, and that's a logical conclusion. So, anyone who lives in Christ does not go on sinning. Anyone who goes on sinning has never really understood Christ and has never known him. If a person belongs to Christ and lives in him, they just don't know about him. They're just not people who say, I've accepted him. They live in him. If a person lives in Christ, who is this? This is a true believer. If it's a true believer, they don't go on sinning. It doesn't mean they don't commit sins, but it means that's not the pattern of their life. They don't go on sinning. They struggle against sin. So anyone who lives in Christ does not go on sinning. And then anyone who goes on sinning, if a person does this, the person who lives in Christ doesn't do this. But if a person does do this, anyone who goes on sinning, who lives in sin, who lives against the will of God and the law of God, who lives against the purpose for which Christ came, that person has never really understood Christ. They're not really believers. They don't really understand why Christ came in the first place and what the plan of God is. Anyone who goes on sinning, lives in sin, rather than living in Christ, has never really understood Christ and has never known him. In other words, they're not believers. They do not belong to him at all.